let's start. Thank you all for coming to the second day of our seminar on state theory. Yesterday, for those who have been here yesterday, especially at the general discussion session, you will remember that one of the issues that came up and was definitely not resolved was the question of the neoliberalism, of the analytical, of whether the concept possesses some analytical substance at all, and even if so, to what extent it is basically politically advisable for the left to use it, and so on and so on. This is basically a very good introduction for what you will be hearing now, since our next lecturer, Werner Bonefeld, will be precisely dealing with the question of neoliberalism, neoliberalism's relation, neoliberal theory's relation to the liberal democratic states, and the implications for the concept of democracy or mass democracy through two of its major theorists, the very well-known Friedrich von Hayek, but also neoliberal or ordo-liberal author, very well-known in Germany, Mueller-Armack. This is Werner Bonefeld is a professor of politics at the York University in the UK, so not the better-known York University in Toronto, better known at least among Marxists. And before I give the word to Werner, as always, please sign in this list of participants. It is very important for us. Thank you. Werner, please.
Right. Hello. Good morning. And I come first with an apology. There's something in your air which makes me sneeze all the time. I left my window open. My eyes are running and quite painful. So I might be interrupting myself, sneezing or sniffing, and I apologize even when that happens, but I'm sure it will happen. The paper is in a number of parts. There's of course an introduction, there are lots of prefaces, there is a section on classical political economy, Adam Smith, where I will not be discussing the invisible hand or liberalism, because you don't find the word liberalism in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or other writing that he undertook to do, nor do you find necessarily lots of writing about the invisible hand. What you do find, however, is a discussion about the state as the political form of the invisible hand, and I will be looking at that. In the next step, I will look at the neoliberals or ordo-liberals as they emerged in the late 1920s, early 1930s in Germany, the Germany of the Weimar Republic, a Germany which politicized socio-economic relations, unstable government, political assassination, etc. And I suppose a liberal then saying laissez-faire, that's life, would look like a rather strange figure. No? You either believe in the free market and then you fight for it, or you not believe in the free market and then you let it go. So we look at this neoliberalism. It was called a political or authoritarian liberalism by its critics because it focused on the state as the locus of rediscovering the logic of a free labor economy. I will then look at Hayek's writing on interstate federalism and the benefits that was to accrue for a free labor economy. In other words, not a coerced labor economy, not an enslaved labor economy, not a planned labor economy, but a free labor economy where the proprietor of labor power is free to compete with everybody else to succeed on the labor market, a free labor economy. I will conclude that section by looking at the principle of subsidiarity that is involved or that is somehow developed in Hayek's account. And that principle I will develop by looking at the European Monetary Union, the system of European Monetary Union, as a system of subsidiarity. And that will lead me to my conclusions. And the conclusions will look at something that Habermas said, namely that this system, the new system of Europe, is a post-democratic system. It's easy to ridiculize Habermas by saying it was always not necessary to do with democracy at all, had other purposes, but it's important nevertheless to indicate or to understand why this proponent of European democracy suddenly turns around and says, Christ, this is an unbound executive, one not constitutionalized, one not bound by the rule of law, one not bound by parliamentary systems of accountability, but in fact an unbound system of executive rule. So I will look at that briefly at the end. So now let me come to my preface. The first is from Simon Clarke, a retired Marxist. He now lives on a boat off the coast of Greece. And he says this: the class character of the state is not defined in national terms. Rather, it derives from the world market, the capitalist law of property and contract transcending national legal systems, and world money transcending national currencies. So, in other words, if you don't behave well in the national economy, however you might want to define its national character, money will disinvest itself, it will move away, and whatever nice policy of full employment you might have had, it turns out to be a policy of unemployment. So you have to attract globally footloose capital onto your shores, and in order to attract it, you have to be productive and profitable. That, of course, limits what the state can do, or limits what a party can do that turned up to endorse a policy, as it were, of welfare redistribution or full employment. The second quotation is for a man called Hallstein, long dead. He was the first commissioner of the EU, or what is then called the European Economic Community. And he reflects in 1972, at least that's the English date of the publication, on his experience as being the commissioner of the EU, or the EEC. And this is the quote: a free market economy is a basic principle of the Treaty of Rome. Such a liberal economic system does not exclude state intervention. On the contrary, it presupposes that the state provides a framework for the operation of such a system. For only an appropriate framework allows each section of the economy to exercise its freedom of action. In fact, compels it to exercise that freedom. So a free market economy at a supranational level, over and above the national states, presupposes the power of the state as the enabler, facilitator, embedder of the framework agreed upon and of the requisite adjustment mechanisms in terms of greater labor productivity and a conception of time in which time is money. We all remember the ABBA song, money, money, money. That really is what this is about. The third comes from a guy called Christoph Engel. He is still alive and writing. He is a prof, an economics prof, I think, somewhere in Germany. He might, in fact, be from a legal department, from a law department. But this is what he has to say. And it's recent, it was published in 2003. A market economy is not a vaccination against the democratic disease. Even if the member states have not succeeded in setting up a proper economic constitution internally, one is imposed on them from the outside. The member states come under a regime of imposed liberty. Or to give another quote which expresses the same sentiments, Helmut Schmidt, the German Chancellor in the late 1970s, was asked why he was advocating the European exchange rate mechanism. And he said, no, it doesn't really matter which government is in office. In Italy, the communists can rule. The monetary policy will discipline them. The system of liberty will be imposed upon them. And what they will have to do, I suppose, is to provide political legitimacy for its acceptance. So that's my quotation from Mr. Engel, not to be confused with Engels, who comes with an S. The next quotation is from a German auto-liberal. It appeared in 1955, or he said this in 1955. The name of the ordo-liberal is Wilhelm Röpke, professor, used to be professor at Marburg University, disliked Nazism wholeheartedly, was one of the very few people who in fact voluntarily exited, was not forced to leave. He left. He couldn't stand the bastards. He left. He taught in Turkey. After 1945, the incoming German government in 1949 wanted him back. He didn't. He stayed in Geneva, where he went from Istanbul. He couldn't cope with Istanbul. He went to Geneva to become an economics professor, and he was the advisor to the German government in many areas of policy making during the 1950s. So a good guy, not a Nazi. Unlike Mueller-Armack, who thought Mein Kampf was a fantastic book. So Röpke has to say, to diminish national sovereignty is most emphatically one of the urgent needs of our time. But the excess of sovereignty, i.e. that was to be cut off at the national level, should be abolished. Put it in the waste bin of history. Get rid of it. Instead of being transferred to a higher political and geographical union. In other words, becoming a member of the EU means that political sovereignty does not transfer to the union. It's being cut off at the national level, but not transferred to a politicized political union, or to a European Union which acts as if it were, and if it were to be becoming a political state. The access of democracy has to be abolished, not transferred, says Röpke in 1955. The last quote is from Habermas, and I quote, "This kind of executive federalism, of a self-authorizing European Council, is a template for a post-democratic exercise of political authority." I will come to the meaning of that statement at the very end. So, the introduction. So what I will do is to look at this identification of European Union as an exception, as it were, to the rule of law. Not just an exception to parliamentary democracy, but also an exception to the rule of law. That's the manner in which Habermas identifies it. And within this identity of the European Union, of an unbound executive, faceless policy making by a cabal of executives hiding behind closed door and announcing their decisions, which then are transferred to national parliaments, who are then under sanction compelled to endorse it to achieve political and other forms of legitimacy. Within this identity, then, there are broad, noisy political movements in member states, stronger here than there, but existing almost everywhere. And these movements are not just moving, they also have certain characteristics. From left, indignados, to new right, neo-fascist golden dawns. So the movement, or the lack of democracy, transferred, as it were, to a democracy of the streets. And that democracy of the streets comes in different shades, some appetizing, some quite disgusting. So I will look at Habermas's thing, providing theoretical and historical context. But before I do that, I want to look into what I'm doing a little bit more closely. And that leads me to a quotation from a woman called Vivian Schmidt, who wrote in 2006, I quote, "While the EU has policy without politics, the member states end up with politics without policy." In a way that seems clear enough. Policy decisions are made in Europe, and politics is the implementation, the execution of these policy decisions. And they are not EU implementations, but national government implementations. So we've got this hierarchy, the subsidiarity again, of a cabal, almost like medieval kings, having a conclave, and then this white bit of smoke turns up when they have reached a decision. and then the national parliaments endorse, enforce, and implement by power or by sovereignty of them being monopoly holders of the legitimate use of violence, to use Weber's definition of the state. And Vivian Schmidt's definition has lots to go by. It's quite insightful, but there's a danger in it, or it's potentially misleading. And the misleading part is when she says ends up with. National states end up with. What does she mean by that? The danger is that there's a sort of state in retreat. No? Some supranational organization is taken over, and here's our poor national state that lost its sovereignty, has to listen to forces over and above itself, has to implement policy, and the implication is, had they been independent, had they been able to make their own choices, then of course they would have endorsed an entirely different policy. They are forced, they ended up with that policy. I'm not saying that Vivian Schmidt necessarily means that, but clearly that possibility of interpretation is implied. The question, though, is why did they sign up to it? It was their executives who went to Brussels and signed the dotted line. Might it not also be the case that the member states don't end up with a policy, but have in fact imposed a policy upon them that they didn't dare to articulate domestically? In other words, is the EU the supranational anchor that allows them to go certain ways without necessarily, in fact, losing political legitimacy, because you can always point your finger at these Brussels bureaucrats who forced your hands, although behind the closed door you did force yourself, happily and independently, to come up with those sorts of decisions. Now let's look theoretically, as it were, why it might be the case that the pursuit of liberty that Brussels imposes, whereas Engels says it's a system of imposed liberty, why this imposition of liberty is, as it were, not in fact undermining the national state, but reinforcing the national state as the monopoly holder of liberty, as the political form of liberty, as the facilitator, enabler, and implementer of liberty. And I look at Adam Smith. So Adam Smith clearly argues that markets work best, that the invisible hand comes into operation, that it's magic that transforms private vices into public virtues just like that, only work when the market is undistorted, when any distortions to the market have been removed, when the invisible hand clearly can function, when the invisible hand clearly is not inhibited by the private interests, by the rebellion of the poor, by the class consciousness of the rich who want to protect their interests. The invisible hand presupposes an undivided, undistorted markets. Have you ever seen the invisible hand removing distortions from market? Attacking the politicized interests. The invisible hand presupposes a force, a power, that in fact is charged with removing impediments to the free market from the market, thereby enabling the invisible hand. And for that reason, I suppose, if you look at Adam Smith's definition of political economy, you might be surprised to see that he does not define political economy as some sort of economic treatise. He doesn't do that. He also doesn't say that political economy is a moral philosophy of invisible principles, almost as if it were a theology. No, he doesn't do that. For Adam Smith, political economy, I quote, is the science of the statesman and legislator. Not the science of the invisible hand, not the science of price preferences, not the science of this and that, as far as the economy is concerned, as far as society is concerned, but a political science, the science of the statesman and legislator. And clearly, if the invisible hand depends upon an unimpaired economic order, and order is not an economic category, but order is a political category. Order is a political category of order making. Furthermore, the law of the market does not, as it were, by its own magic impose itself. Law does not apply to disorder, does not apply to bloodshed, does not apply to rebellion. All of that suspends the rule of law, the law of the market, the law of unimpeded, free, utility-seeking individuals making their choices in response to price movements. In other words, the law of the market presupposes the order of the market. Law and order is the wrong sequence. It's order and law. And Smith develops this idea of the state as the embodiment, as the force, as the political form of order. On a first reading, you will see of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and his other work that the state is responsible to defend its territory from foreign invasion. Wealth in Smith, of course, is not conquest, stealing from the gold from the Indians, as it were. There's a mercantilism. But wealth is the productive power of labor, which depends on the law of private property, and the state is there to defend it. He says, between two equal rights, or between clashes of interests, force decides. The force is the state. You find the same quotation or the same sentiment expressed in Marx's Capital when he deals with the length of the Labor Day. Between two equal rights, force decides, and in Smith, what decides between two clashes of interest is the power of the state. But the state in Smith does more. It is also responsible for achieving what he calls the cheapness of provision. It's not the capitalist who is responsible for achieving the cheapness of provision in Smith, it's the state. In Smith, anything to do with commerce, exchange, cheapness of provision, etc., calls for what he calls police. And police in Smith is not the police as such, but police in Smith is policy. It's a matter of policy. And policy is a matter of rules, the rules of the game. Policy is a matter of regulating the market. To say that cutthroat competition is fine as long as you in fact don't cut throats, sets limits, provides the exchange between equals with a certain civility, the civility of a civil constitution. So let's look into these things a little bit more closely. First, I'll start with class struggle in Smith. And you find that about the pages 83 to 95 in the Wealth of Nations. So he introduces the class struggle. He says, wages, quote, depend upon a contract between two parties whose interests are not the same. The master wants to pay as little as possible, he says. The workman wants to get as much as possible. So there is a conflict of interest. It's irreconcilable. They are always battering away, he says. And it's clear, he says, why the workers do that. Their situation, he says, is desperate. They really live in the shit. Work badly, in bad conditions. Desperate. And their despair which forces them to struggle. But they shouldn't, he says. Because the masters are fewer in numbers, he says. They will combine and starve the worker to death. They are stronger. So the class struggle, in this class struggle, the masters have the upper hand. But also he seems to argue, the workers, if they riot, it's understandable. If they strike, it's understandable. But it's almost a Lukácsian term here in Smith. It's wrong. It's false consciousness. They do not know what is good for them. They do not know, he says, what is good for them, because the masters will win. the situations will not improve. And what is good for them, he says, is in fact the progress of the Commonwealth, the further increase in productive power, because that, he says, the expansion of the market will create what he calls the liberal reward for labor, which means bigger demand, higher demand for labor, therefore higher wages for labor, improvement of laboring conditions, and thus, he says, there is this trickle-down effect. And the trickle-down effect is the beneficial effect of what he calls the system of liberty. And that is, he says, the only way for workers to improve their conditions. In other words, work harder, don't comply, be keen to increase your productivity, and hope for the best, that in some future wealth will trickle down. For if you strike, and strikes are a very understandable reaction to misery, you in fact jeopardize the liberal reward for labor, and the masters will combine because there are fewer in numbers, and since there are fewer in numbers, they will beat you back. Then Adam Smith also looks at the masters themselves. So he says the system of liberty, or commercial society, or capitalist society, or bourgeois society, all the different names for the same thing, flourishes to the benefit of the national interests, to the benefit of the workers, but he says not necessarily to the benefits of the owner of capital, of stock. Because greater investment, he says, tends to lower profits. So there's a tendency of a decline in profit. The more you invest, profits might decline. And if profits decline, he says, these masters, these capitalists, are the only ones with true class consciousness. Rather than adhering to the logic of the market and going bankrupt, or fighting for greater labor productivity, risking their investment, they try to monopolize prices. They carve up markets. They call for protectionist measures. And all these measures, he says, are in fact measures that hinder the further progress of the division of labor, hinder the further progress of the increase in the productivity of labor, and therefore are detrimental to the interests of workers and the national wealth. So I quote from Smith, and this is from the beginning, introduction to his lectures on jurisprudence. He says, the assertion of private power, i.e. monopoly pricing, cartels, trusts, protectionist measures. This assertion of private power produces what we call police. Whatever regulations are made with respect to the trade, commerce, agriculture, manufacture of the country are considered to belonging to the police, to the state, to policy making. So the state here in Smith appears something like the embodiment, the consciousness of the system of liberty. And the system of liberty clearly cannot be entrusted to capitalists because they will cutthroat or they will protect themselves by monopoly pricing. And the system of liberty, which depends on the continuous increase in labor productivity, comes, as it were, to a stall. It stops. There's a standstill suddenly. And if there is a standstill, then clearly something is amiss. If there is a crisis, then clearly something is amiss. And that, he says, calls for the police, again, to facilitate, I quote again from page 6 or 7 of the lectures on jurisprudence, to facilitate the cheapness of all goods by means of greater labor productivity. That, he says, is a political responsibility. The next point I want to make with regards to Smith is this. Smith, too, does not define the state or society in national terms. For Smith, the division of labor is an international division of labor, and the national state operates within, therefore, world market conditions. And he says, almost like the beginning of the Clark quote I had. No? Remember that money and law transcend national borders, impose themselves upon national state, and thereby forcing the national states to be good states of liberty, market liberty, the liberty of a free market economy, the economy of free labor. So Smith says, the proprietor of stock is properly a citizen of the world and is not necessarily attached to any particular country. He or she, he didn't talk about cheese, but he or she would apt to abandon the country in which he was exposed to a vexatious inquisition in order to be assessed to a burdensome tax, and would remove his business to another country where he can employ his investment with greater ease. So in other words, liberty. Don't ask too many questions. Let the capitalists do what the capitalists do best, based on the rule of law, of course, based on the civil character of society, but don't tax them too much. The other side of that is, of course, that if a company in a certain economy is not as productive as a company over there, well, then things have to happen. No? Adjustments have to happen. And he says that too is a matter then of police. That is, of course, the contemporary debate about location, Standort. No? Don't complain about the Chinese. Beat them. That's the message, Smith. So Smith then is both a cosmopolitan in terms of the global division of labor and somebody who defines the state as the political form of the invisible hand. It makes the market possible. It facilitates and enables. The state is the independent power of society. It is not a capitalist state because the capitalists own it, because the capitalists can really not be trusted. They are the baddies here. It clearly forces the workers to work because that's good for them, at least as far as their long-term prospects are concerned. And it is responsible for facilitating the system of liberty over and above the competing interests, social forces, classes, and pluralistic interests. So when Marx then with Engels writes in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeois is a cosmopolitan and that the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, that didn't really invent the wheel, as it were. It was quite precise commentary, although written in a pamphlet sort of way, about the Smith's classical political economy. So that leads me to my second bunch, the German ordo-liberals. Before I go into that, are the matters clear, you think, about Smith and the need of a political form that civilizes the conduct and is not to be captured, as it were, by the private interests, but is meant to be ruling over them? So, the ordo-liberals. Now I start with an author who doesn't actually belong to them. It's Milton Friedman, our man from Chicago, who wasted no time to proclaim that the system of liberty, and for the sake of the system of liberty, got on the plane to advise the Pinochet dictatorship in the early 1970s as to how to make an economy free, how to free it. And in Capitalism and Freedom, he writes this, and I go through, and the reason I quote this to you is simply because I believe it's a very cogent contemporary definition of the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. So Friedman argues them, and I run through these quotations. You find them, if you want, on pages 15 to 34. So he says, the state is essential, both as a forum for determining the rules of the game and as an empire to interpret and enforce the rules decided upon. And enforcement, he says, is necessary, on the part of those few who would otherwise not play the game. That is, the organization of economic activity through voluntary exchanges presumes that we have provided through government for the maintenance of law and order, to prevent coercion of one individual by another, the enforcement of contracts voluntarily entered into, the definition of the meaning of property rights, the interpretation and enforcement of these rights, and the provision of a monetary framework. The state, he says, has to promote competition, almost like in Smith, nothing much different there, and do for the market what the market cannot do for itself, i.e. maintain the system of liberty, giving it order. He says, liberals, we really, have to employ political channels to reconcile differences. In other words, there's the idea of the executive committee. You meet and you discuss, you reconcile differences. Because the state, he says, is the organization that provides the means whereby we, us, liberals, can modify the rules. And the question, of course, is what happens when they interfere? The other. And the other, of course, was a figure which popped up in the 1920s. What we consider, particularly in the western part of Europe, as democracy is very young. I think women only got the vote in France in 1946. In England, in the 1920s, graduates and businessmen had 3 votes, opposed to the working class person who had only 1 person, I say, because the female vote only came in, I was at 28. So what we consider democracy is quite a recent thing. 1 person, 1 vote over a certain age and of course a certain nationality. Quite recent. Was consequence of the upheaval of the First World War to a great extent. This intrusion of the demos into the state. This capture of parliament by majorities which were no longer liberal majorities, where the liberal state, as it were, lost its liberal constituency in parliament. The democracy, as it were, as we wish to proclaim it, the demos, came to the fore as a political equal. What to do with the state of liberty? With the lawmaking for liberty? What happens when the demos interferes and gets in? You will remember Hayek's rule of serfdom. He says that is dangerous. There are 2 things we have to be clear about, he says. We are either governed by the rule of law, or we are governed by the democratic majority principle. It's either or. If it's the idea of the democratic rule of law, not a democratic majority principle, what happens to our rule of law? It is democratized. It becomes an expression of mass opinion, mass mobilization, mass emotions, mass idea, the mass demos, the idea of the masses for freedom from want, for welfare, support. That's the democratic principle. If you think it through, he says, democracy, if unlimited, if not tied to a liberal foundation, that, he says, ends in tyranny, says Hayek. Von Mises says, the Austrian guy, it ends up in planned chaos. And the German ordo-liberals say, yeah, it does end up in planned chaos. It does end up in tyranny. And in fact, the Weimar Republic, towards the end, late 1920s, early 1930s, for them, was a state in turmoil, an ungovernable state, a weak state, a state that was governed by the social forces, each carving out a bit of state for themselves. And the state, they say, therefore lost its capacity to govern. So that's the meaning of ordo-liberalism, or neoliberalism. The term itself was coined by Ristov in 1938 at a meeting of the Walter Lippmann colloquium, which was some sort of forerunner of the later Mont-Pelerin Society. And he says, neoliberalism is not laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is for the economy. Laissez-faire is for you lot. You compete on the markets for jobs. But laissez-faire is no basis upon which a state, a political economy, can be run. These Austrians, Van Mises, just a theologian, just a believer. We liberals believe in liberty, and therefore we stand up for liberty. And in order to stand up for liberty, our neoliberalism is a liberalism of the state as a political force, as the force of liberty. Rostov calls that force of liberty, he says the state is a market police. I mean, just remember the word police from Smith. So Rostov creates the idea of the state as market police, as enabling, as enforcing, as governing, not only over society, but also through society, governing the mentality of a people, a mentality of entrepreneurs, a mentality of enterprise, a mentality that does not rebel against the consequences of the manner in which the price movement moved to your disadvantage, but the mentality that considers unemployment as an opportunity for employment, not as a complaint, not as a misery, but as an opportunity. Get on your bike. When you're free, you're responsible for yourself. When you're free, you're responsible for yourself. You cannot be free and irresponsible. You're free and responsible, and if you're responsible, you're also liable to the consequences of the decision that you have made. So this neoliberalism, this ordoliberalism, as defined by Röpke then, in fact, looked at the state. Or it argues that, or it says, the primacy of the political, or it argues for, the primacy of the political, in order to render economy free. So these neoliberals dismiss the idea of the night watchman state as a liberal state. The white watchman state is a puppet, does nothing. The system of liberty depends on the state as the political form of the invisible hand. This state has to be independent, they say, from the antagonistic interests, from the pluralistic interests, from the social forces. It has to be independent for it to set order so that you can be free, to be able to respond freely by your own choice as your own individual or privatized utility seekers to the movement of prices, to the spontaneous order. So the spontaneous order of the market that Hayek speaks about so much is in fact a political order. Hayek in The Road to Serfdom does not say the state should not intervene. This is nonsense, he says. The existence of the state presupposes state intervention. It does not intervene into itself. The question really is the kind of intervention, the purpose of intervention. Is it intervening, he says, to suspend the free price mechanism, leading us to tyranny? By which he meant everything from Bismarckian socialism to Bolshevism to Keynesianism to social democracy? Or is it intervening to set the market free? And he says, clearly the state is a planner. And I quote, the state plans for competition. And this exercise of planning, the same as the police in Smith, setting the market free and providing for the cheapness of provision. This planning, he said, of the state is of course hindered or in question or imperiled by an unlimited democracy which does not know how to limit itself, which therefore democratizes the liberal rule of law, And this democratic state for Hayek is a weak state. This democratic state for the older liberals is a weak state. It's weak because it is unable to limit itself to the pursuit of liberty. It is weak because it gives in to social pressures. It is weak because it responds to, mass demonstrations by saying, yes, you are right, we give you what you want, no, go home. That is weakness. That is not rule by the liberal state. That is the weak state. That is the state, they say, that is devoured, eaten up, decomposed, fragmented by the social interests. The weak state governs according to principles. And the principle is the principle of the system of liberty. You can demonstrate in Greece, but is the Greek state really a weak state? Enforcing everything what has been agreed over a society in turmoil. For the liberals, I guess, the Greek state has proven itself to be a strong state. It did not give in. Here was the principle of liberty, the principle of enforcement of debt, the principle that sets you free as entrepreneurs. In other words, a principle that no longer allows you to say or to go to the state to ask the state what it can do for you. The principle that states ask yourself what you can do for the state, in fact, by paying taxes, by engaging in productive work, by increasing the commonwealth. That was the principle enforced by the Greek state. Does that make the Greek state weak or strong as the monopoly holder that polices the cheapness of provision, that enforces the system of liberty, and that does not, as it were, give in to the pressure of the streets, to the democracy of the streets, to what what Weber called the street dictators? Is that a weak state? According to these guys, clearly not. It stuck to its guns, imposed liberty. So I quote from Ristov then, the definition of the strong state or the danger towards the state. He defines the weak state as something that is pulled apart by greedy self-seekers, he says. Each of them cuts out a piece of state power for him or herself and exploits it for its own purposes. The proletarians for welfare, the farmers for farm subsidies, the industrialist for protectionism. Each of them exploits it for its own purposes. This phenomenon, he says, can best be described by a term used by Carl Schmitt, who later became the legal philosopher of fascism. It can be described, he says, as pluralism. Indeed, he says, it represents a pluralism of the worst possible kind. The motto of this mentality seems to be the role of the state as a suitable prey for the sake of liberty. What is therefore needed is a state that governs, that is, a strong state, a state standing where it belongs, above the economy and above the interest groups or the social forces or the classes, and puts them into the framework of liberty. So it's only the strong state that can distinguish itself from society. The weak state is eaten up by it. The democratic state is weakened up by society, devoured, forced down, becomes the prey. So for the older liberals then, I quote, liberalism is always to focus on the whole, not on the particular. And the whole is the state, says Rabka in a book called Against the Tide. The danger, therefore, is that the liberal state is made illiberal by mass democracy, by the democratization of lawmaking, by a state that opens it up to the masses and gives a bit to the masses. I'll come to that in a wee while in my second section. Next section. But first, laissez-faire. Let's look at laissez-faire again. Laissez-faire in neoliberalism or liberalism describes an economic order. Laissez-faire is not a political category. The state is not up for negotiation. It is not meant to be governed by those who win, as it were, the contest or the market contest by means of election. Laissez-faire does not extend to the state. Indeed, laissez-faire, I quote, is a highly ambiguous and misleading description of the principles on which a liberal policy is based. That was Hayek, the author of laissez-faire liberalism. It does not extend to the state. Competition, he says, or Röpke says, is not a principle on which the whole society can be built. From the sociological and moral point of view, it is even dangerous because it tends more to dissolve than to unite. I quote, I stop here for a while. Of course, what is the force of unity in competition? If we all compete against each other, what is the unity that gives us, as it were, a sense of purpose? If we all compete, then we are all competitors. Who gives us the rule of the game? Mercedes-Benz? Or some defunct car company in Britain? So competition is a disuniting concept. It's a concept of the self. And the concept of the self, they say, is very important because that is what gives dynamic direction, purpose to the economy. But it dissolves more, says Röpke, than it unifies. It's self-destructive, says Röpke, because it dissolves more than it unifies. There needs therefore to be a power that provides competition with a framework in which it can operate, in which competition can unfold, so that it does not dissolve, so that it is united, so that it is civilized. So competition belongs to civil society as an ordered form of one against the other. So laissez-faire, then, is not a principle over which a society can be built. It can be built only on the basis of a sound political and moral framework. Laissez-faire, says Röpke, is no answer to riots. Let them riot. It's not an answer to riots. They don't stop when you allow them to riot. What stops riot is police. It is neither an answer, says Röpke, to the hungry hordes of vested interests that dissolves into the mafia, that dissolves into monopoly, that dissolves into protectionism. Laissez-faire is no answer to the hungry hordes, he said, of the vested interests. An unlimited mass democracy that does not know how to limit itself to the pursuit of freedom, to that laissez-faire is also no answer. To bring this to the end, I quote from Martin Wolf, who was and still the chief economist of the Financial Times. He still writes for it. He said in the early 2000s, a free labor economy cannot be built on pious aspirations. It rests, he says, on organized, coercive force. The force of the state. Or let's step one step back and return to Hayek. Liberalism, he says, does not demand weakness from the state, but only freedom for economic development under state protection. So, the state is the force that eradicates disorder, that facilitates the freedom of the market, that helps the invisible hand to to do its trick, no? To do its magic of transforming private vices into public virtues. So says Böhm, who is another of the older liberals, I quote, "The state is the mistress of the economy, in its totality as in its part. And the state must master the whole of economic development, both intellectually and materially." So the free market, I'm quoting again from Böhm in 1973, he wrote that in response to some German Keynesian who thought this was all to do with totality and totalitarianism. And he answers, Böhm, he says, "The economic constitution of liberty amounts to an eminently political decision." So economic freedom is not an economic decision. It is, he says, an eminently political decision of government, of a praxis of government that has to be made time and time again. So this neoliberal state is therefore not this weakish, squeamish, almost disappearing state that almost seems to be in retreat, a night watchman that looks over you when you sleep so that the nightmare doesn't come. It is in fact a strong state, a state that does not let itself become the prey of the social forces and does not let itself become the prey of the antagonistic interests. It governs society for the sake of liberty. So when we step forward a little bit and we look at European construction, what seems to be clear is the no demos sign, no democracy sign on everything undertaken in the name of European liberty in terms of European free markets. And I quote from Merschel, some German economist. He says, "Organization through competition," in other words, organizing society on the basis of, by means of, and through competition, requires no more than clearing away of obstacles. We come across that already. It was in Smith, it was the stuff I just talked away, but the clearing away of obstacles. And that is, of course, the liberal status, the police of the market. But one of these identified obstacles is mass democracy, because it interferes with the free price mechanism. It politicizes social existence. It politicizes socio-economic relations. It demands a freedom from want. So, how to get rid of this obstacle? This democratic, as it were, incorporation of the demos. How to contain, how to tie mass democracy to liberal foundations, to a liberal principle, to the liberal state. So when these arguments were made in the late 1920s in Germany and early 1930s, that was part of the rightist critique of Weimar democracy. In the 1950s, these same arguments returned, but now as part of the anti-totalitarian new conservatism, I guess, or new liberalism, because it identified mass democracy as the foundation of the tyranny that had come Germany's way. So it's an immense transformation from rightist critique of Weimar democracy to anti-totalitarian enlightenment in the 1950s. And one way I argue in which the democracy of that was rebuilt in the western part in the 1950s was tied, was captured, was fettered to liberal state principles, was by means of European integration. And how that might have been, I give you a quote from de Gaulle in 1971. De Gaulle reflected in his autobiography on why he, as the great French nationalist, signed up to the treaty. He did not sign up, but he was responsible for implementing it. why he implemented it with such eagerness and keenness, giving away, as it were, sovereignty. And he said he thought the Treaty of Rome was fantastic because it enforced upon French industry the need to adapt to markets, to increase productivity, to become competitive. And he, de Gaulle, he says, I didn't have even to change my policy. It was done by market pressures. So let's look at how that might be so. It's my third part of my presentation, and that deals largely with Hayek again, and also with Mueller-Armack, who called what I'm talking about, it's a very strange, very nice, in fact, German word, it's so difficult to translate. He calls this a Stabilitätsgemeinschaft. So Stabilität is stability, and Gemeinschaft is community. So he calls the setup, for which he was majorly responsible, because Mueller-Armack, who in the 1920s wrote for a paper called Die Tat, which was a paper of the fascist movement, who in 1933 declared Mein Kampf a fantastic book, you need to read it, and who then, after 1945, became the German representative at the negotiations of the Maastricht Treaty, working under Erhard in the economics ministry. He called the outcome a community for stability. And the community of stability is the one I will now tell you about in terms of Hayek's conception of it. So Hayek asked in 1939 for an interstate federal system. He said that such an arrangement would prevent inflationary demands, which is so to be a consequence of the unlimited character of mass democracy. He endorsed supranationalism as a means of encouraging competitiveness against national policies of economic protectionism. It says, he said, it supported the depoliticization of economic relations against the power of the special interests, which are no longer able, he said, in a supranational system to subject the national states to commit to material concessions. The state, as it were, as a potential prey, disappears from the picture. And all of this, he said, is such a wonderful thing that money is itself denationalized. It would be a supranational monetary unit, a supranational monetary policy, and therefore domestic demands for, I suppose, protectionism by means of this perverse thing, namely currency devaluation, which increases your labor productivity as if by magic overnight. That would also disappear. What in fact you have to do is to adapt to world market prices by greater labor productivity, not by the manipulation of the exchange rate. That, he said, would also be a great thing. It would be protected from mass democratic encroachment, mass democratic capacity of interference in the free price mechanism. And he said, in such a scenario, I quote, the restriction of child labor or working hours becomes difficult to carry out for the individual states, because child labor suddenly becomes a necessity of survival. In a system where adjustment is really called for, where the idea of a social democratic idea of a freedom from one goes down the drain, in a system which really asks you to be enterprising, entrepreneurial, and to be self-responsible, and to use your freedom in self-responsible manners. And if, of course, you are poor, then clearly that is an indication that you made the wrong choices. So he says, in such a system, popular pressures can go nowhere, because there is no state with the power to respond. There is no state that become the prey of these pressures. What is regulated at the supranational level is the rule of law, is an agreement. There is even no door to knock on, as it were. Or to forget about Hayek for the moment, whom should the trade union movement complain against? Against is clear, but where should it go? Should it go to the capital city and demonstrate? And the politicians leaning out of their balconies and saying, oh, we love you all. If only we could do something for you. Our hands are tied behind our backs. And then you troop off to Brussels, and the bureaucrats don't normally say we love you all, but they say we're just bureaucrats. We don't make the rules. Our job is to implement the rules that's been done by somebody else. Somehow in between. No? You're protesting in the twilight zone. You're not quite sure where to go. And for Hayek, that really, he says, would expel the mob, as it were, from the seat of government, would enfeeble parliamentary democracies, because parliamentary majority decisions in parliament would not make law, but would endorse law made somewhere else. Yeah? So this is our friend Hayek speaking. And now let's go to EMU. But before I go to EMU, I just found another nice quote from Engel, Christoph Engel, with whom I started in the preamble. He says, "The system of supranational rules and national policies of market adjustments make Europe the stronghold of the fight to save member states' civil society." It's not you who make civil society. It's Europe that makes civil society. That is, subsidiarity emphasizes the liberal foundation of liberal democracy. It gives you rules of conduct. It sets the rules of the game. It says what is permissible and what is not permissible. It provides, in other words, a legal framework for your freedom, for the exercise of your freedom, for the spontaneity of your actions as buyers and sellers on the market, as consumers, as traders in labor power. And all that without fighting on the streets, without shoplifting, without stealing, without collective organization which coerces others to your will. The free economy of labor is therefore civil, by means of European rule of law, European regulation, and a state, a national state, that is no longer in a position to become your prey, to act upon your special interests. In fact, it governs over you for the benefit of the Commonwealth, for the benefit of the liberal reward for labor. So, and that system is called subsidiarity. Let's talk about the system of subsidiarity very briefly. It's very quick. I refer to Padua Schioppa, Italian economist, very strongly participating, or one of the authors, founder of the Treaty of Monetary Union, Maastricht Treaty on Monetary Union. And I quote, "Subsidiarity, not the Leviathan, is the catchword for European political union." EMU, he says, is like a depersonalized collective prince, like Machiavelli. No? Not a person, it's a prince without a republic, but it's a depersonalized collective prince. So it's a collective prince that appears without government. There's no European government. It's a collective prince of rules. It's a collective prince that is charged with pursuing a tight monetary policy, so that we all know what is happening. No? We cannot be manipulated by the private interest. We can all adjust to tight monetary conditions. It governs you, the European Central Bank. The question then is, what is the court of the prince, and who is the fourth estate? And the court of the prince is fiscal policy in EMU. And the fourth estate are the territorialized labor markets that are enabled and facilitated to compete against each other for the benefit of wealth for the benefit of greater labor productivity. The difficulty in this construction, EMU, was not the notion of the prince, was not monetary union. There were difficulties about whether or not politicians should or should not have something to say, questions about democratic accountability, how tight the EMU should be, all sorts of things turned up, but clear EMU in terms of monetary policy was supranational. Clearly too, the fourth estates, the plebeians, the working classes, you were meant to live well, compete well and be highly productive in wherever you are and compete with your neighbor. Who's better with your labor power? Where shall the investment go? Who adjusts better? There was no issue about that either, I guess. The issue really was where to place fiscal policy. Shall it be at the supranational level, or shall it remain with the national states? And in these discussions about fiscal policy, neither of these two options was a good one. Because supranationalizing fiscal policy is the nightmare of the ordoliberal dream. Because it would provide Europe with state powers, tax raising and tax redistributing powers. Hayek, therefore, in the late 1970s, turned his back on his earlier endorsement of interstate federalism, fearing precisely that there would be, with monetary union, a political union, and that this political union might not have the stomach to be strong, might be weak, might be give in to pressures. So fiscal policy could not be a European concern. But what happens if you just give it to the national states? And they respond to pressures with great weakness, lacking resolve. That's fantastically bad, they say, because that is beggar your neighbor policy. That forces the others to help them out. The very idea of monetary union as a means of disciplining each of you in the pursuit of freedom, that very idea would become obsolete. These guys were quite right in thinking if monetary union, if the euro is to be strong, then fiscal policy has to be pro-cyclical, not anti-cyclical. And pro-cyclical means if you have money, you can spend it, and if you have none, you don't. Then you have to make fiscal retrenchment. Then you have to retrench it. You have to take money out of the pockets of people in order to meet the objective. Monetary tightness, adjustment. Wages can go up, wages can go down. Workers can move from places of unemployment to places of employment. That's the adjustment mechanism, not fiscal policy. So what happened with fiscal policy? It was somehow situated in the twilight zone. It remained formally the sovereignty of the states, the parliaments, to set budgets, but under strict convergency criteria or stability rules. And the stability rules have now been, as it were, reinforced. I think that's true to say, with the fiscal pact and other mechanisms in response to the crisis. But what has not happened is any challenge or any change to the system of subsidiarity. The Union has no fiscal raising powers. It has no direct fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility has remained with member states. They just are not able to do what they want to do. The Union sets targets. The Union goes to see whether the targets have been met. If the member state is found out to have not met targets, the member state can be fined. But it's not that Brussels has a fiscal policy. It has a regime of fiscal enforcement or enforcement of fiscal rules. Yeah? And in this wonderful system of subsidiarity, there is, of course, no access to political power, to come back to the quotation from Röpke, at the European level. At the same time, national sovereignty has been diminished. A system of subsidiarity is in operation of a denationalized currency. of a fiscal retrenchment for which nobody seems to be entirely responsible, and of competing national labor markets as the fantastic outcome of the principle of subsidiarity, which, returning to Hayek, might lead to the reintroduction of child labor as a means of meeting productivity demands of the economy to adhere to world market conditions. So this structure of subsidiarity is therefore a structure, I argue, that in fact reinforces the liberal character of the national states as market police. They are responsible for the cheapness of provision. The demos is still there, it has not been, as it were, abandoned. Elections are still taking place for national parliaments, which have become, as it were, the legitimizers by debate of rules decided upon by somebody else. So democracy, as it were, has not been de-democratized. It has just been limited to the pursuit of market-enabling rules. So if you think about the modern state, a liberal hyphen democracy, the hyphenated state, clearly the democratic element of the hyphen is made to work quite well for the liberal definition of our, as it were, means of our mode of social reproduction. Let me now conclude briefly on Habermas. You will remember I started with Habermas saying this is a post-democratic system. It is run by the European Council as some sort of authority that is extra-constitutional in its decision-makings. It's dangerous, he says. It takes us back to to kingdoms of the medieval times when the rulers met and decided and then went back to their lands, and that was that. And I guess, clearly, there is a lot to say about that. The European Council was never quite clear what was its constitutional standing. And the Lisbon Treaty tried to, as it were, give it some standing, give it some recognition. But still, is the European Council meant to make law in Europe? Not really, no? It's different processes involved. But who made all these decisions, as it were, on the fiscal pact? You mentioned Merkel yesterday and her friends. That is the European Council of the heads of states of the Euro Club. So it seems that rules are made by the decision of executives. Not by parliaments, of course, but also not, in the case of the European Union, by organs that are meant to make, as it were, law, but by sovereign decision makers. So Habermas therefore claims there's an unbound executive at work in Europe. Decisionism, as it were, has been taken over from the rule of law, from democratically made law. Democracy, what we know as conventional forms of democracy, is there to endorse decisions, but not to make decisions. And that is a complete reversal of the democratic tradition, which always looked at Parliament as lawmaker, as the executive, as the executor of law. Now, he says, in Europe, what we have is the opposite. We've got the executive making decisions, which are then transformed into national law by parliaments. That takes us back, he says, far back. He calls that post-democratic. So an evil conclave of rule. And clearly, there's something in that. In relationship to democracy, two things, I guess, come up. The first, was very much endorsed, expressed, and argued for by Schumpeter, who argued that democracy is an absolutely wonderful system. It allows for the peaceful circulation of elites by means of competitive elections. And I guess that really is what we are having as far as the conventional political processes are concerned in Europe right now. You are all, at the time of elections, asked to put your ballot, to make a ballot, to make a view, to put it in the ballot box. And then we have a national parliament that is enfeebled, and we have a government that is headed by whatever you call it, prime minister or chancellor or prime minister. And they then become part of the conclave in Europe, in Brussels, to make decisions, which are then coming back to your parliaments for endorsement. So democracy, says Schumpeter, is fantastic. The elite no longer has to kill each other. There's no need for coups and things like that. Democracy is a wonderful system of competitive circulation of elites by means of competition. So there's the active voter doing elections. Then there is the passive citizens after the election has been done, after the election has been completed, and the active citizens then reverts to his or her role as the entrepreneur of his or her own self-interest. That's the Schumpeterian definition of democracy, which very much comes out of these transformations. The second is, of course, the demos itself. The demos on the street, which has assembled most noisily, sometimes in refusal to the policies that the national parliaments have been endorsing. And I guess the democracy of the streets might well put paid to Schumpeter's appraisal of democracy. Not because of the power of horizontalism, but because of its national leanings. The democracy of the streets, quite a lot of it, takes the system of subsidiarity very seriously. Lots of democracies on the streets assert their own sort of national demands, national aspirations in competition with other territorialized labor markets. So the system of subsidiarity not only stimulates competition between territorialized labor markets, it also tends to nationalize the rejection of austerity. So not every dawn, and therefore, in that case, not every dawn is golden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Werner, for this mesmerizing lecture. Unfortunately, we do not have very much time left for discussion, if at all. One or two questions. But we can cut this short, I believe, with a clear consciousness, because we have still 2 hours of general debate later on. So whoever wants to comment or ask some questions should come to the general discussion, which starts at 5:30. But before that, one question or comment.
The answer is yes.
Regardless of the question. Okay, so I think then we can stop it here. And one announcement for those who haven't heard yet. As you will see, most of you will have seen on the program that Bob Jessup was supposed to be here and give a lecture at 3:30. Unfortunately, he had to cancel almost literally in the last moment. But we will try to set up a Skype connection, and he will try to deliver his lecture this way. Hopefully it works out technologically. So I hope to see most of you here again at 3:30 for the Skype experience. Yes. Thank you.